In the summer of 1943, a towed sleeve drifted across a hot Florida sky while a line of American trainees hosed it with .50 caliber fire. The tracers stitched a perfect glowing seam in front of the target. The sleeve kept flying. The scorecard read 0. The instructor walked the line and said the thing that sounded like heresy to anyone who had ever aimed a rifle. Stop chasing the nose. Put your fire behind the target. Hold it there. Let the airplane fly into your stream. It felt wrong because our eyes lie in motion. A crossing aircraft at 300 miles per hour covers more than 200 feet. In the half-second it takes a .50 cal bullet to travel 400 yards. Aim at the nose and you are already late. Swing well ahead, and the tracers will look right as they miss in front. Add angle off and parallax, and the human brain, designed to throw stones and lead ducks, falls for the same trap over and over. Pretty pictures, empty sky. The fix was to replace instinct with a system. Geometry, timing, standard leads, and then drill that system until behind felt natural and ahead felt like a mistake. Early in the war, American gunnery looked better than it performed. Navy 20mm crews filled the air with sparks and splashes. Attackers threaded the gaps and hit their marks. Bomber waist gunners poured fire at fighters that flashed past in a handful of seconds and rarely scored. Fighter pilots walked bursts across where an enemy ought to be and watched him slip out of frame. Range cameras and towed sleeves told the truth. Hit rates of a few percent, often less under stress. It wasn't cowardice. It was physics beating habit. The physics problem is simple to write and hard to feel. Bullets slow in air. Targets don't. A crossing shot demands angular lead that grows with speed, distance, and angle off. But what you see through a sight as you pan is not what the firing solution demands. Motion parallax compresses apparent lead. Your tracers, which do not fly exactly like the darker ball and armor-piercing rounds beside them, lure your eye into overleading. You correct the wrong error and double it. The result is a ribbon of fire in front of the threat and a hit count that looks like you never showed up. The fix began in classrooms and dark trainers. The Army Air Forces used the Waller and Sacked gunnery trainers to project aircraft on a screen and record a gun's motion against correct lead. The Navy filmed sleeves and drones with synchronized cameras and scored every hole. Instructors could finally show a 19-year-old the ugly math of his own hands. When you felt on, you were ahead. When you held a fuselage length behind, you got hits. They wrote rules a tired brain could apply. At 200 yards and 200 meters crossing, lag about a wing length. At 300 yards and 250 meters, hold a fuselage and a half. At steeper angles, reduce lead and stabilize the rate. The mantra was constant. Track smooth, hold lag, don't chase tracers. Shipboard doctrine caught up. The best way to kill a fast-crossing torpedo bomber with 40mm and 20mm wasn't to slash the nose and hope. It was to build a fence, lay a steady stream behind the aircraft's path and let closure do the work. The Mark 51 director stabilized 40mm mounts and let a pointer keep a constant rate. Training emphasized rate over drama. Keep the crank steady, hold aft of the wing root, feed belts, and let the airplane obligingly fly through your pattern. The rounds per kill fell. The myth that gunnery is a matter of courage died on contact with a director and a lesson plan. Fighter schools taught the same lesson in the language of pursuit curves. Pure pursuit, nose on target, closes fast but bleeds angles and often produces a miss. Lead pursuit, nose ahead, creates the classic deflection shot but tempts you into overshoot if you don't manage energy. Lag pursuit, nose behind, stabilizes closure, reduces angle off, and sets you up to convert to a brief burst of lead at the squeeze. When gyroscopic lead computing sights, K14, Mk14, arrived, the paradox deepened. Keep the pipper on the target, and the sight will do the aim-ahead math for you. To a pilot raised on Kentucky windage, it felt like aiming at while hitting far in front. The visual was behind. The solution lived inside the glass. Behind also fixed two chronic lies. First, tracers. Early war tracer elements burned, shifted weight, and diverged ballistically from AP and ball. Gunners who chased the glow rode the wrong part of the stream, reducing tracer ratios and teaching men to read structure breaks instead of spark showers put attention back on what mattered: engine blocks, wing routes, pilot cockpits. Second, convergence. Fighter groups that standardized gun convergence, often 250-300 yards, and harmonized sights to that distance, stopped spraying and started sawing pieces out of enemy aircraft. The point wasn't to make a picture. It was to build a lethal pattern exactly where geometry said the enemy would be. Numbers rewarded discipline. In 1942, destroyers might fire thousands of rounds per plane downed. Some of that was tech: hand-aimed mounts, contact fuses that too often skated past, but much of it was human. As directors spread, as proximity fuses appeared, and as crews stopped slashing at noses and learned to hold aft, the rounds per kill shrank and the confidence grew. Bomber commands that rationalized ammunition belts, API and APIT mixes, fewer tracers, reported more structural kills in fewer passes. Fighter groups that adopted gyro sights and enforced lag-to-lead transitions saw crossing shot effectiveness multiply. When reports said twice as many planes shot down, it wasn't a miracle. It was the sum of small corrections made routine. The deeper change was cultural. American gunnery schools stopped worshiping feel and started teaching measurement. They built checklists, drilled standard sight pictures, and punished the chase. They told crews that steadiness beats bravado, and that the worst thing you could do with a gun was to make it look exciting. Aim behind became shorthand for a bundle of habits that tamed angle off and time of flight. The advice sounded like caution and turned into aggression, because hits are the only form of aggression that matters. Closure was the hidden ally. A fast crossing target does part of your work for you. If you hold a stable lag and keep the gun moving at the right rate, the aircraft will intersect your stream even if your sight never looks right. The fence kills the runner. The trick is to resist fixing a picture that offends your eye. The measure of a trained gunner was simple. Could he keep his hands quiet when his brain begged to reach for the nose? All of this hinged on standardization. Sight alignment and harmonization were checked daily. Directors were calibrated. Turret parallax tables were posted and memorized. Instructors corrected in the same words at every range. A waist gunner in Italy and a pointer on a destroyer in the Solomons heard the same mantra in different accents: rate, lag, hold. That sameness turned into a result across oceans and services. Fewer wasted belts, more broken wings. The last piece was honesty about fatigue. Good gunnery is a rate problem. Tired hands wobble rates. The services built rest into watches, rotated mounts, and saved best crews for worst sectors. That kind of waste paid with airplanes the next day. Redundancy in manning, extra hands at the loader's position, spare pointers at the ready, wasn't indulgence. It was hit probability in human form. By late 1943, the heresy had become doctrine. Aim behind the target didn't mean never lead. It meant never overlead, never chase glow, and never let a pretty picture steal your hits. The payoff showed up wherever Americans pointed guns at fast airplanes, from carrier decks to high-altitude boxes. What changed next amplified the effect. Directors got smarter, sights got better, fuses woke up at the right distance, and the same trained hands kept their rates. That's when the kill lines bent upward and stayed there. The moment aim behind left chalkboards and hit real skies, the change was obvious to anyone counting wrecks instead of tracers. Early war destroyers that had burned through belts and barrels to bring down a single torpedo bomber began reporting fewer rounds per kill. Carrier captains who had watched attackers skate through streams of perfect fire now saw aircraft break apart in the least intuitive moment, just after the gun crews stopped chasing the nose and held their rate aft of the wing route. The picture on deck calmed down. The results did not. Shipboard anti-air doctrine had to overcome two habits at once: the human urge to slash at what frightens you and the institutional comfort of hand-aimed mounts. The U.S. Navy solved the first with training, and the second with machines that rewarded that training. The Mark 51 director gave 40mm Bofors crews a stabilized sight and a simple job: track the target smoothly at a constant rate, keep the pipper trailing the fuselage, let the director feed lead to the guns. The Mark 37 fire control system and its Mk1A rangekeeper did the same for 5-inch batteries at longer range, turning angle off and time of flight into deflection without asking a tired pointer to do mental arithmetic. Once proximity, VT, fuses arrived, the 5-inch projectile no longer had to hit a wing to be lethal. Close became good enough. Put these pieces together and the advice that sounded like caution, hold behind, hold steady, turned into aggression made mechanical. Crews who resisted the urge to chase were deadly because their guns no longer needed to be persuaded to do math. The math lived in the director. Below decks, the difference looked like discipline. Loader teams learned to keep belts moving without rate spikes. Captains accepted that the most dangerous moment in a pass was the one when a target's aspect made hold behind feel the least natural, and they backed their crews for holding anyway. Gunnery officers stopped praising the loudest mounts and started praising the steadiest pointers. Picture-pretty streams in front of the nose became a sign of poor training, not of vigor. The same logic traveled to the air in turret lessons that saved lives when seconds mattered. Bomber formations faced an enemy that adapted quickly. Frontal attacks to collapse firing arcs. High-angle slashes to confuse sight pictures. Head-on passes where parallax and time of flight punished any man who believed what he saw. Gunners learned rules that sounded backward and worked. Against a head-on fighter, do not put fire on the canopy. Hold below the nose in top turrets, and above the nose in lower mounts to correct parallax and bullet drop. Against a crossing tail chase, do not center the fuselage. Hold behind the tail and keep the rate constant while closure does the rest. Instructors hammered home that the most expensive mistakes came from chasing motion with the sight instead of making the enemy fly through a stable stream. Equipment helped, but not by magic. Reflector sights were standardized and bore-sighted to convergence distances. Turret lead cams and compensators took some of the mental load off the gunner. On later platforms like the B-29, central fire control analog computers and stabilized sights made deflection nearly automatic across remote turrets. But the system worked only because crews had learned not to fight the solution with their hands. The computer could put lead on a calculated future. The human had to resist pulling it back to the present. In fighter cockpits, the shift from Kentucky windage to computation changed habits that had been nearly religious. A pilot taught to squeeze bursts with the sight just ahead of the enemy's nose discovered that he scored more hits by flying lag pursuit, stabilizing angle off, and then letting a gyro sight do the heretical thing. Tell him the muzzle was not pointed where the bullets would be. The K-14 and its naval cousin let you dial enemy wingspan, keep the pipper on the plane, and squeeze. Springs and gyros answered with lead that a human could not calculate in a snap roll. Shooters who trusted that alien feeling, I am aiming at the airplane and somehow hitting in front of it, saw their film come back with crosses on engines. Not long, pretty misses ahead of the prop arc. Ammunition mixes matured as well. Early belts heavy with tracers trained bad eyes. Later belts balanced API, AP, and a sane tracer ratio so that the stream's destructive part did the work, while the glowing part coached without lying. Crews were taught to read damage, not sparkle. Oil smoke from a radial, a line of holes walking into a wing root, a control surface tearing loose. Even the language changed. Splashy became a slur. Steady became praise. Towed sleeves and drones did more than build confidence. They provided data. Range notebooks recorded groups and hit percentages at varied angles and speeds. Instructors could point to numbers. Hit rates doubled when crews held a measured lag and kept bearing rate constant. Ammunition expenditure for a sleeve kill fell by half when students stopped trying to carve their names across a target's nose. You can argue with doctrine. It is harder to argue with a scoreboard that says your old way wastes twice as much ammunition to get the same result. The lesson even reached places where nothing about the fight encouraged patience. In the Solomons, where attackers came low and fast and the horizon hid threats until they were nearly on top of you, the temptation to throw a wall of panic fire was nearly irresistible. Divisions and task groups that enforced rate, lag, hold, and used directors as intended printed a different after-action vocabulary. Steady tracking fire, break-up at crossing, wings separated at a beam. The units that could not break old habits wrote, heavy firing observed ahead of approach, no hits until pullout, plane passed through barrage. War at sea is merciless to false pictures. The doctrine rewarded the crews who trusted something that looked wrong and kept their hands quiet. The other half of the story is the enemy's geometry. A torpedo bomber in a low crossing run, or a dive bomber pulling out presents a shrinking window in which bullets fired now will intersect an airframe then. Overleading during that window is not just a miss. It is an invitation for the attacker to complete his run unhurt. Holding a half fuselage or more aft is the only way to keep your stream where the airplane will be instead of where your fear wishes it were. Tracers that look like just behind at one range are on at another. That is why recorded bearing rate and consistent training beat improvisation and shouts on a hot deck. The numbers that circulated in late 1943 and 1944 inside commands were not advertising. They were maintenance reports and ammunition logs turned into performance charts. Destroyer divisions reported reductions in rounds per downed aircraft as Mark 51 directors proliferated. Carrier groups recorded improved kill ratios when they adopted strict pointer training and reduced tracer loads. Fighter groups flying with gyro sights posted higher percentages on crossing shots. Bomber commands logged fewer ammunition pallets expended per mission with more observed kills when gunners harmonized sights, respected convergence, and stopped chasing light. Twice as many wasn't a blanket promise. It was the median of dozens of incremental gains adding up across platforms and theaters. It is worth stating what aim behind does not mean, because misunderstanding it produces the same misses for different reasons. It does not mean refuse to lead. It means refuse to overlead by picture chasing on crossing shots. It does not mean lag is always correct. Head-on attacks demanded a different hold. Tail chases demanded patience and vertical corrections more than lateral. Steep dives compressed time of flight so hard that behind could be a single rivet's worth of metal. The doctrine taught men to classify the geometry at a glance and choose the correct habit, not to apply the same hold to every scene. As equipment improved, the doctrine became more forgiving without becoming less necessary. Proximity fuses turned near misses into shards and fireballs. Directors compensated for ship motion and human shake. Gyro sights reduced the need for an intuitive lead picture. But every one of those tools depended on a human who had been taught not to sabotage the solution with frantic correction. The director can compute. It cannot stop your hand from snatching the sight onto a nose because your eye cannot stand the thought that behind will work. The sight can display perfect lead. It cannot keep you from squeezing too early because the pipper looks wrong. The fuse can detonate near a wing. It cannot replace the habit of holding a stable rate instead of slashing at a fleeting image. Training films captured the conversion because film could humiliate bad habits in a way lectures never could. You see a fighter enter frame. The gunner's sight walk ahead. Tracers carve emptiness. The fighter flash past unhurt. Cut. Same pass, same speed. Sight held a fuselage length aft, bearing rate smooth. The fighter blooms into smoke just a beam. Watch that 5 times, and your pride recovers enough to do the thing that felt like cowardice, and turns out to be the only kind of bravery that matters in gunnery. Resisting your own impulses. By late 1944, the last step was standardization across commands. So a sailor transferred from a destroyer in the Atlantic to a carrier in the Pacific didn't have to unlearn anything. Manuals converged on the same wording. Diagrams showed the same angles. Gunnery officers used the same critique language. Hold aft. Do not chase. Maintain rate. Even the belts were labeled with mixes that matched. The effect at scale was invisible until an attack came in, and a dozen mounts spoke with one voice instead of a dozen. Accents. The irony of the doctrine is that it asks men to do less with their hands and more with their heads under the worst kind of pressure. It tells a 19-year-old waist gunner or a 22-year-old pointer that the most courageous thing he can do is to not try harder, but to keep the same rate he had on the trainer last week. That is not a speech anyone wants to hear before the fight. It is the speech that makes the difference when the fight lasts long enough to reward the disciplined. There is also a moral hidden inside the math. Aim behind succeeded because it was a testable claim that survived testing. Instructors filmed, scored, and measured. Crews adjusted. Officers enforced what worked. With each cycle, confidence shifted from what felt right to what returned hits. The institutional humility to change a sight picture in peacetime practice produced results in wartime chaos. A fleet that could not do that would have kept missing in front with bravery and died on schedule. The doctrine's final proof came when the enemy changed tactics and the hit rates stayed up. Low, weaving approaches, sudden last-second jinks, head-on dives that turned into skids at the merge. None of it broke trained crews because they were not married to a picture. They were married to a process. Identify geometry. Choose hold. Set rate. Keep rate. Fire. When the process was right, the bullets and the airplanes found each other where an untrained eye would never have put them. The next section takes this from doctrine to operational payoff. How these small corrections, multiplied by better sights, smarter directors, and new fuses, turned whole engagements at sea and in the air, from the Solomons through the Philippine Sea and up to the picket lines off Okinawa, where the only thing between a ship and a sky full of intent was a crew that could keep calm hands and aim where instinct told them not. 2. The proof landed where it had to, on water and over islands, where the difference between a pretty stream and a lethal one was measured in wreckage and deck logs. In the Solomons, 1942 had been the year of panic fire. Hand-aimed mounts slashing at low torpedo bombers, tracer happy belts teaching bad eyes, barrage ahead, written in after-action reports that ended with no observed hits. By mid-1943, the tone changed. The same sea lanes saw ships with Mark 51 directors and steadier crews hold fire aft of wing routes and keep bearing rate constant. The vocabulary changed with the habit. Steady tracking. Break at a beam. Wing parted crossing. The sky did not get kinder. The hands got calmer. Directors multiplied the effect of training because they rewarded the man who resisted his instincts. A 40-millimeter crew on a stable platform with a Mark 51 could take a weaving approach that once provoked wasted slashes and turn it into a fatal fence. The pointer didn't chase. He matched rate. The trainer didn't jerk. He smoothed. The director translated that steadiness into lead, and the airplane did the work of flying into the stream. The picture on deck looked boring. The results did not. Ammunition expenditure per downed aircraft fell, sometimes by half, not because men became braver, but because they stopped mistaking drama for accuracy. The 5-inch batteries grew teeth when the fuse caught up with the doctrine. Proximity fuses made the long-range envelope real. Before VT, a 5-inch shell had to meet a wing or a fuselage to matter. Close was a near miss with no consequence. With VT, close became a blast sphere whose radius didn't care, whether the human eye would have called that shot ahead or behind. Fire control systems like the Mark 37 and its rangekeeper cranked out. Deflection while directors and radars fed them range and bearing. The fuse made the last correction for human imperfection. But even then, the shooter's job didn't change. Hold the bearing rate, hold the lag for the geometry, and let the system do the piece your hands cannot. Ships that tried to add to the solution with last-second slashes threw it away. Ships that trusted the math watched attackers come apart at ranges where, a year earlier, they had flown through emptiness. You could see the same conversion in bomber formations. In 1943, German fighters learned to abuse sight pictures with head-on passes. A gunner who believed his eyes put tracers on a canopy and drilled air under the nose. A gunner who learned the rule: hold below the nose in top turrets, above the nose in lower mounts. Trust parallax tables. Shoot where the airplane will be. Started logging brakes and engine hits in the same scenario. Later, on B-29s, Central Fire Control took the principle even closer to "Don't fight it!" Remote. Turrets with analog computers and stabilized. Sights let one gunner control multiple. Stations with a solution the machine built from. Angular rates and range. The man's job was to keep rate, manage priorities, and refuse to sabotage the solution by hauling the sight onto an image that offended him. Combat film from the Marianas and China-Burma, India shows the same heresy paying off. The sight paints a calm lead. The stream lives where the film doesn't suggest it should. The interceptor breaks when he crosses the invisible line. Fighter cockpits told a parallel story. In 1942, a pilot who could eyeball deflection was a scarce asset, and even the best wasted ammunition on crossing shots that felt right. By late 1944, gyro sights meant an average pilot, if he kept a lag curve and believed the pipper, could make the kind of kill that once demanded a gift. The K-14 and Naval Mark 14 sights paid for themselves in film canisters. Squadrons wrote home that their percentage on quartering and beam shots jumped. Pilots who had learned to fly lag until the moment of squeeze stopped blowing through and started arriving on debrief with engines scored and radiators holed. The feeling of aiming at, while the bullets landed ahead, became normal because the sight did the math, and pilots learned to stop interfering. Operationally, the payoffs were cumulative and public. In the Marianas, the day the press named for turkeys owed as much to cap and radar as to shipboard guns, but the ships did their part more efficiently than they had in 1942. Radar got fighters in the right slice of sky. Directors and fuses made the ships slice thicker. Trained crews made both slices lethal. Attackers who emerged from fighter screens met fences, not pictures. Fleet commanders noticed the difference in the simplest place. Logistics. Ammunition loadouts lasted longer. Replenishment cycles stretched. The fleet's pace stopped being hostage to how much 20 mm and 40 mm had been burned in the last push. That is what doctrine looks like when it pays. Days added to an operation schedule without changing the plan. On the far side of the war's calendar lay Okinawa, a test of whether disciplined behind could stand up to something that did not care about survival. Picket destroyers and destroyer escorts took positions where radar would give maximum warning and fire would be loneliest. In that bleak geometry, the old gunnery sins would have been fatal. Chase the nose turns into miss, then die, when the attacker is a human, steering toward your stack. Commands that drilled rate, lag, and steadiness wrote fewer last sentences that ended in smoke. The integration of CIC, fighter direction, 5-inch with VT, 40mm with Mark 51, and trained crews didn't make picket duty safe. It made it survivable often enough to matter. Reports from ships that endured multiple raids in a day show the pattern. Early detection. Fighters committed. Long-range 5-inch proximity bursts ripping up formations. Close-in Bofors and Oerlikons holding fire aft and breaking singletons on the beam. The misses you can hear on gun decks, streams carving the air beautifully in front of a diving dot, appear less often in the logs after training takes. In their place are short, ugly sentences. Plane disintegrated abeam. Wings separated. Engine exploded at 1,500 yards. The doctrine spread inland too. Army anti-air units that had started with searchlights and guesses ended with radar directors that did for 90mm and 40mm what naval directors did afloat. In Europe, SCR 584 radar mated to the M9 director, and proximity-fused shells turned V1 intercept into an exercise in geometry rather than heroics. When the process worked, track, compute, hold rate, the flying bombs fell in numbers that made headlines. Behind those headlines sat the same repair of human instinct. Do not chase the blur. Put fire where the solution says the target will be. Let closure carry your shell into the necessary space. Even on the smallest mounts, the logic. Scaled. Quad on 50s on half-tracks and island. Airstrips killed strafers when gunners treated. The mount like a director with muscles. Bearing rate constant. Aim kept a fraction aft. Tracer ratio tamed so the eye didn't lie. Units that insisted every man cycle through trainers and memorize parallax tables recovered ammunition otherwise wasted on streaks that looked righteous and accomplished nothing. The same rule saved pilots' lives who were strafed on takeoff, and gunners' hands who had to fight through fear to keep a stream where it didn't look right. Numbers made the case beyond anecdotes. Destroyer divisions tracked rounds fired per downed aircraft before and after Mark 51 saturation. The curves moved. Carrier groups compared engagement reports across cruises as proximity fuses and pointer training spread. The ratios improved. Air forces compared gun camera tallies with ammunition expenditure before and after, gyro sights and convergence harmonization. Crossing shot effectiveness rose. Bomber commands recorded fewer pallets, moved to dispersal fields for the same claimed and confirmed kills once belts were rationalized, and sight pictures standardized. Twice as many was never a magic spell. It was the average of many small deltas, 10% here, 20% there, spread across ships, groups, and months until the war's arithmetic tilted. The enemy noticed. Japanese pilots briefed that American flak had become sticky on the beam, the worst place to cross, and that diving jinks no longer slipped through what had looked like gaps. German pilots grumbled that bombers with the new sights were too accurate on the curve, and that closing to the comfortable angle no longer worked. When opponents alter their attack profiles to avoid your process is winning even before it shoots them down. Logistics underscored the doctrine's value in a quieter way. Ammunition ships could arrive when planned instead of when panic required. Training syllabi stabilized because officers no longer had to throw out sections to teach emergency fixes for bad habits that refused to die. Replacement crews folded into mounts and turrets faster, because the language and pictures were the same across theaters. Sailor could rotate from a destroyer in the Atlantic to a carrier in the Pacific and point his gun the same way, with the same words in his head, without bleeding hits during the changeover. That sameness wasn't bureaucracy. It was combat power that traveled. The doctrine also scaled upward into how commanders thought about defense in depth. If the shipboard slice improved by steadiness and directors, then the cap slice could be tasked to different geometries. Fighters did not have to chase every leaker to the waterline. They had confidence that the outer and inner rings would do their share. That trust let fighter direction play percentages. Vector to the heaviest inbound, leave the low singletons for the 40s and 20s, save fuel for the next wave. Numbers are not only bullets and bodies. They are minutes and miles. Critics sometimes dismiss aim behind as a catchy phrase that hides complexity. That is fair as far as slogans go and wrong as far as doctrine goes. The complexity lives in classification: head-on, beam, quartering, stern, fast, slow, near, far, and in the different holds each demands. The phrase survives because it corrects the most common, costly error under stress: the human tendency to overlead and to believe what the brightest part of the belt tells the eye. A man who has been taught to resist that temptation will still miss sometimes. A man who has not been taught to resist it will miss almost always when the target crosses fast. The final operational proof is the one any sailor or airman recognizes instinctively. The noise level drops when people know what to do. Mount talkers say fewer words. CIC says fewer frantic vectors. Cockpits carry fewer curse words between breaths. The quiet is not peace. It is the sound of a system doing what it was built to do. A pointer holding rate, a gunner holding a strange-looking sight picture, a director carrying angle off into lead, a fuse correcting the last yards. You do not hear the fence being built. You see what tries to cross it fall apart. The next piece of the story is not about hardware at all. It is about what it took to make don't chase, hold aft, keep rate, survive rotation, fatigue, fear, and turnover. It is about the training loops that kept 19-year-olds from dragging solutions back to their eyes, the harmonization checks that made sights and guns agree, the leadership choices that rewarded quiet mounts and steady hands, and the humility it required to make a generation forget what felt right and do what worked. That is where the doctrine became culture, and where the numbers stopped being a promise and became a habit. Training loops made doctrine survive contact with turnover. Units built a rhythm: teach on the trainer, prove on the sleeve, calibrate on the mount, audit after the shoot. A new pointer did not touch a live director until he had drawn sight pictures on a blackboard, worked the bearing rate wheel in a classroom, and watched film of his own mistakes. A new waist gunner did not fly without logging hours in a projector room, calling angles, and learning to ignore glow. A fighter pilot did not strap on a gyro sight without shooting the pattern targets that showed him what "keep the pipper on" felt like at different Gs. The point wasn't to create prodigies. It was to build a floor so high that the average man could do what once required a gift. Checks and harmonization turned into a religion, because small errors multiply at speed. Every ship posted daily bore sight and parallax checks for each mount. Gunnery officers signed off on director calibration and reported variances to CIC so doctrine matched reality. Bomber groups ran sight harmonization at the start of every cycle, so that a top turret in one ship and a tail turret in another agreed on what 200 yards meant. Fighter ground crews set convergence at the squadron standard, not at a pilot's whim, and pilots learned to shoot inside that bracket instead of wish a lucky scatter into a hit. A system that tolerates drift teaches bad hands to feel good. A system that forbids drift lets good hands become common. The language of critique changed, too. After a bad run, debriefs no longer praised aggressive fire. They circled rate spikes, overlead, tracer chase. They replayed film of mounts that flinched at the last second and let a target slip. They highlighted gunners who held aft and quietly cut airplanes in half. The Navy even patterned belts to coach better. Less tracer to tempt the hand. More API to do damage. Enough signature for alignment, but not so much that men shot the glow. The Air Force's codified belts that matched targets. API for engine and spar work. Incendiary for self-sealing tanks. And hammered home that hits behind the pilot do more for you than sparks in front of his prop. Leadership cemented the culture because leaders changed what they praised. Captains learned to prefer quiet mounts that killed over loud mounts that impressed. Squadron COs rewarded pilots who returned with film that showed minimum spray and maximum breakage, not the men who came back with empty belts and adjectives. Group commanders picked gunnery officers who cared about checklists and correction, not just charisma on the range. In that environment, a 19-year-old stopped trying to look like a movie and started trying to sound like a checklist. Rate, lag, hold became not just a tip, but an identity. Cross-pollination kept the standard from drifting. Destroyer men rotated to carriers and carried the Mark 51 discipline to decks where the temptation to slash was greatest. Carrier men rotated to escorts and brought a respect for director solutions to ships where the sea punished wobble. Bomber gunners taught fighter pilots what a crossing shot looked like from the other end of a stream. Fighter pilots taught bomber gunners what a quartering attack felt like at closure. In the same way, the Navy borrowed from the Army's obsession with harmonization, and the Army borrowed from the Navy's piety about director calibration. The common vocabulary of geometry, head-on, beam, quartering, angle-off, bearing rate, replaced unit dialects and personal hacks. Metrics sealed the change. Commands tracked rounds per kill, hits per 100 rounds, and engagement outcomes by aspect. Crews could see their percentages move when they held lag and kept rate. They could see the ammunition ship arrive later on the schedule when they resisted the urge to help the director. They could see the kill claims stand up in post-mission analysis when the film showed steady streams intersecting airplanes at a beam instead of spectacular fireworks ahead of noses. Numbers are not motivational speeches. They are proof that a habit is worth the effort it takes to hold it when fear insists you let go. None of this made the fight easy or clean. Men still froze. Hands still snatched a last-second overcorrection and threw away perfect solutions. Pilots still yanked the nose to the wrong picture and watched a burst pass in front of a wing that should have fallen off. But the ratio changed. A system that punishes mistakes forgives fewer. A culture that trains to resist those mistakes forgives more when it counts. By late war, enough men had the right reflexes that the enemy could feel it in the angles he avoided. the doctrine did not stay frozen when the hardware evolved. As proximity fuses spread, behind became more tolerant at medium ranges. Close was now close enough. As radar directors improved, the shipboard slice of air defense extended outward. Gun crews saw fewer last-second scrambles and more deliberate tracking solutions. As gyro sights became standard, fighter pilots stopped needing a personal wizard's feel for deflection and started needing faith in a pipper. Each technical step made the doctrine more forgiving without changing the core advice. Don't chase pictures. Trust process. There are cautionary edges worth keeping. Aim behind remains a correction for the most common error, not a law of nature. At shallow angle-off or tail chase, the holds are small and often vertical. The game becomes patience and bullet drop, not lateral lag. Head-on preserves a few unforgiving rules. Parallax in turrets, the brief window in a fighter's sight where a fraction of a degree matters. A man who applies behind like a hammer still misses. The culture that birthed the phrase also taught classification. Name the geometry first. Choose the habit second. When the story is told as twice as many, it can sound like a slogan. The reality is more granular and more useful. A 20% improvement in 40mm effectiveness from Mark 51 directors plus a 30% improvement from pointer training plus a 25% boost from sane belts plus a 40% boost in 5-inch lethality from proximity fuses plus a 20–30% increase in fighter hit rates from gyro sights equals a fleet that defends itself and its aircraft, with fewer shells and more wreckage. The right image is not a banner. It is a ledger with many columns where small gains added into something the enemy could not ignore. This way of thinking bled forward into eras when guns ceded much of the sky to missiles. The same habits, trust the solution, don't chase the picture, maintain rate, governed directors that now pointed launchers and radars that now drove intercepts. On the ground, the army that had learned to aim where a V1 would be used radar directors and fused shells to meet jets and rockets. In cockpits, lead computing logic migrated into pipper symbology and weapons envelopes that told you when your instinct was lying and your solution was ready. Tools change. Geometry doesn't. Neither does the human temptation to fight the math because the view feels wrong. If you want a final measure of what the doctrine achieved, listen to the enemy's last adjustments. Japanese pilots were told to vary their approach angles, to jink in the dive, to avoid the beam. German pilots were told to jettison early or break away if a bomber held a steady picture rather than a slashing one. Both sets of instructions are admissions. They concede that the American fence was real, that the space where nothing used to be was now crowded with incoming rounds, and that the only comfort left lay in unpredictability rather than in exploiting steady human errors. When the enemy is forced to fly the fight you have trained for, your training has already paid. What finally made aim behind stick wasn't just a more accurate reticle or a smoother director. It was the humility to let evidence outrank instinct. An instructor filmed misses that looked beautiful and made young men watch them until beauty felt like failure. A chief posted checklists that made heroes out of men who could turn a wheel at a constant rate. A captain stood on a bridge and praised quiet mounts. A squadron leader refused to let a gifted pilot freelance shots outside the harmonization bracket because he knew he was training a group, not worshiping a talent. Those choices built a culture where doing the boring thing under pressure saved ships, saved crews, and killed airplanes. The principle travels beyond the gun. In any craft where time of flight, angle off, and parallax punish hurried hands, surgery, flying, engineering, even writing code, the urge to chase pictures is strong and wrong. The cure is the same. Measure, standardize, coach. Trust the solution you prepared when your heart rate was normal. If you want to tell this story as more than a curious footnote about tracers lying, tell it as a manual for building reflexes that survive fear. From that hot Florida sky to black nights over islands and gray mornings on picket stations, the thread is unbroken. Men learn to put their fire where it did not look right, hold it there while every nerve screamed to fix the picture, and trust that closure, computation, and training would do the rest. The sleeve ripped, then the drones, then the torpedo bombers, then the fighters. The numbers in the logbooks moved because hands-on grips became steadier, sights became smarter, fuses became kinder to small errors, and leaders became stingier with praise for the wrong kind of bravery. Put the doctrine in one line and it reads like a paradox. To hit what is fastest, you must refuse to chase it. Put the war in one line and it reads like a lesson. Small, proven corrections. Repeated everywhere. Beat strong instincts. Repeated everywhere. Put the payoff in one line and it reads like the truth that got an instructor to walk a line of guns and tell men something that made no sense until it saved ships. Aim behind the target and watch the airplane fly into your fire. If you want more stories where a counterintuitive fix doubled effectiveness, say so below and tell us where you're watching from. If this helped you see the sky differently, share it. The next time a bright picture tempts your hands, remember what the numbers taught. Rate, lag, hold.